The first gunshot echoed through the valley like thunder, sending a flock of startled birds into the crisp autumn sky as Margaret Keller clutched her bleeding shoulder and urged her exhausted mare forward. October 1878 had turned bitter in the New Mexico territory, and as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountains near Abiquiu, she knew the men pursuing her wouldn't stop until they found what they believed she had stolen. "Just a little further, girl," Margaret whispered to her horse, the baby strapped to her chest whimpering softly beneath her tattered shawl. The infant, barely 3 weeks old, had been remarkably quiet through their desperate flight, as though understanding their very lives depended on silence. The second shot came closer, kicking up dust near her horse's hooves. Margaret leaned lower, pain searing through her shoulder and down her side. Blood soaked through her dress, making the fabric stick to her skin. The wound from the previous night's confrontation had reopened, and fresh blood mingled with the dried stains that already marked her once blue dress. She hadn't stolen anything, but trying to convince Lloyd Patterson and his gang of that had proven impossible. Her late husband's supposed debt had become her burden, and when she'd refused to hand over the deed to their small homestead, the only inheritance for her newborn daughter Patterson, had decided to take matters into his own hands. "There she is," a voice shouted from behind, and Margaret knew she couldn't outrun them much longer. Her horse was spent, her strength failing, and the baby needed care she couldn't provide while fleeing. The trail ahead forked, one path leading toward the small town of Abiquiu, the other winding into dense pine forest that would eventually lead to higher country. With night approaching and her pursuers closing in, Margaret made her choice, steering her mare toward the trees. The densely wooded area might provide cover until she could figure out what to do next. Her vision blurred as she navigated the increasingly narrow trail. The baby began to cry in earnest now, hungry and disturbed by the rough ride. Margaret's milk had all but dried up from stress, exhaustion, and blood loss. The bullet had gone clean through her shoulder, but without proper care, infection was inevitable. "Hush, little one," she murmured, though she knew it was useless. Her daughter needed food, warmth, and a mother who could hold her properly, all things Margaret couldn't provide in that moment. When her horse stumbled on the rocky path, Margaret nearly toppled forward. She managed to steady herself, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her wounded shoulder. The distant shouts of Patterson's men seemed to fade momentarily, but Margaret didn't dare hope they'd given up. More likely they were regrouping, perhaps splitting up to cover more ground. As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped sharply. Margaret's breath formed small clouds in the air, and she worried about her baby getting too cold. The infant's cries had subsided to whimpers, which frightened Margaret more than the crying. Her daughter was growing too weak to protest her discomfort. The horse picked its way carefully down a steep embankment toward a small creek. Margaret knew they needed to stop. She couldn't see the trail clearly anymore, and continuing blindly might lead them off a cliff in this unfamiliar territory. When they reached the water's edge, she slid awkwardly from the saddle, nearly collapsing as her feet hit the ground. Using one arm to support her baby, Margaret led the horse to drink while she assessed their situation. The creek offered water, but the open area made them vulnerable. Moving unsteadily along the bank, she spotted what appeared to be an overhang in the rocky cliff face, not quite a cave, but shelter nonetheless. By the time she reached it, Margaret's legs could barely support her. She sank to the ground, her back against cold stone, and carefully untied the makeshift sling that held her daughter. The baby's face was pale, her lips taking on a bluish tint that made Margaret's heart seize with fear. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her dirt-streaked face. I don't know what to do." She tried to nurse the child, but her milk wouldn't come. The baby latched weakly for a moment before turning away, too exhausted to continue trying. Margaret fumbled with the small pack she'd managed to grab during their escape, hoping to find anything that might help. But it contained only a spare cloth diaper, a small knife, and a few dried biscuits. The night grew colder. Margaret wrapped her daughter in her shawl and held her close, trying to share what little body heat she had. Her shoulder throbbed relentlessly, and she could feel the heat of infection beginning to spread. If she didn't get help by morning, she feared neither of them would survive another day. When Margaret heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, she pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the overhang, praying her dark clothes would blend with the night. Her mare, still loose nearby, nickered softly in response to the newcomer's horse. "Easy there," a male voice called out, and Margaret held her breath. It didn't sound like Patterson or any of his men, but she couldn't risk being wrong. The stranger dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. A lantern flared to life, casting long shadows across the creek bank. "Hello," he called. "I saw your horse. You injured?" Margaret remained silent, though her baby chose that moment to release a weak cry. The light swung in her direction. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man said, moving closer. "Just riding night patrol for the Easton Ranch. Heard gunshots earlier." When the lantern light finally reached her hiding place, Margaret blinked against the sudden brightness. The man holding it was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in typical cowboy attire, worn denim, leather chaps, a bandana around his neck, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A rifle hung from his saddle, but his hand rested casually at his side, not on his holstered pistol. "Christ almighty," he muttered when he saw her condition. "Madam, you're bleeding something fierce." Margaret clutched her baby tighter. "Stay back. I don't know you." He lowered the lantern slightly and took a slow step forward. "Name's Matthew Donovan. I work for the Easton, spread about 5 miles west of here." He gestured toward her shoulder. "You need a doctor." "There are men after me," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They think I have something that belonged to my husband." Matthew Donovan crouched down, setting the lantern beside him. His face came into clearer view, younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with serious blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't hide a small scar along his jaw. "Your baby doesn't look too good," he said gently. "Neither do you. Whatever trouble you're in, it can wait until we get you both somewhere safe and warm." Margaret wanted to refuse, to send him away before Patterson's men found them both, but her daughter released another pitiful whimper, and she knew she had no choice. Her vision swam, darkness creeping at the edges. "I can't hold her properly," Margaret admitted, her voice breaking. "My milk won't come, and she's so cold." Matthew moved closer slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "May I?" he asked, reaching toward the baby. Margaret hesitated, then nodded weakly. As Matthew carefully took the infant from her arms, Margaret felt the last of her strength ebbing away. The relief of having her daughter's weight lifted from her wounded side was immediate, but so was the rush of fever that had been building for hours. "What's your name, madam?" Matthew asked, cradling the baby expertly against his chest, tucking her inside his coat for warmth. "Margaret," she managed. "Margaret Keller, my daughter. Hasn't been named yet. My husband died before she was born." Matthew nodded, his expression grave as he assessed her wound. "Well, Mrs. Keller, I'm going to get you and this little one to safety. Can you ride?" Margaret tried to stand but swayed dangerously. "I don't think so." "That's all right," he said, and with surprising gentleness for his size, he helped her to her feet. "You'll ride with me and we'll lead your mare. The ranch is closer than town and my boss's wife knows about doctoring." As Matthew helped Margaret onto his horse, keeping the baby secure with one arm, she felt consciousness slipping away. The last thing she remembered was the solid warmth of his body behind her as he mounted the horse, one strong arm holding her steady while the other cradled her daughter. "I've got you both," his voice rumbled against her back. "Just hold on a little longer." Margaret awoke to unfamiliar surroundings, a small but clean room with simple furnishings. Sunlight streamed through a curtained window, and for a moment she couldn't remember how she'd gotten there. Then the pain in her shoulder brought everything rushing back. "My baby," she gasped, trying to sit up despite the stabbing pain the movement caused. "She's right here," a woman's voice answered. "Safe and sound." Margaret turned her head to see an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair sitting in a rocking chair near the window, holding a small bundle in her arms. "I'm Eliza Easton," the woman said. "Matthew brought you and your little one to our ranch in the middle of the night. You've been fighting a fever for 2 days. 2 days." Margaret tried again to sit up, succeeding partially this time. "Is she all right? She wasn't eating." Eliza nodded, rising from her chair and bringing the baby to Margaret's bedside. "She's doing better. We've been feeding her goat's milk with a bit of sugar water. Not ideal, but she's taking it well enough." The relief of seeing her daughter's pink face and hearing that she'd been fed was overwhelming. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks as Eliza carefully placed the swaddled infant in the crook of her uninjured arm. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, looking down at her daughter. The baby's eyes opened slightly dark blue like her father's had been, and Margaret felt a surge of love so powerful it momentarily overshadowed her pain. "Don't thank me yet," Eliza said, her tone becoming more serious. "Your shoulder took a bullet clean through, but the wound had started festering by the time Matthew found you. I've cleaned it as best I could, but you'll need to keep still if you want it to heal properly." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a knock sounded at the door, and Matthew Donovan's tall frame filled the doorway. "Mrs. Easton, he stopped when he saw Margaret was awake. "You're back with us. Good." Margaret nodded, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance and the fact that someone, presumably Eliza, had changed her into a clean nightgown. "Mr. Donovan, I don't know how to thank you." He stepped into the room, hat in hand. "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Eliza corrected him with a fond smile. "Most men would have taken her straight to town. Infection and baby be damned." She turned back to Margaret. "Matthew's been checking on you both every few hours when he wasn't out with the cattle. Seems he's taken quite an interest in your well-being." Matthew's cheeks colored slightly beneath his tan. "Just doing what's right, madam." He cleared his throat. "Actually, I came to tell you that I rode into Abiquiu this morning. Sheriff Morris says there's been a group of men asking about a woman with a baby. Mentioned something about stolen property." Margaret's heart sank. "They followed me here. Not to the ranch, no," Matthew assured her, "but they've been nosing around town. Sheriff asked what their business was, and they claimed to be looking for a thief." His blue eyes narrowed. "I didn't mention you, but I'd like to hear your side of things if you're feeling up to telling it." Eliza patted Margaret's hand. "You don't have to talk now if you're not ready." "You need rest." "No," Margaret said, looking down at her daughter. "You deserve to know what kind of trouble I've brought to your door." After Eliza helped her into a more comfortable sitting position, propped up with pillows and the baby nestled securely beside her, Margaret began her story. "My husband, Thomas Keller, and I had a small homestead about 30 miles east of here. He died 6 months ago, thrown from his horse while checking fence lines. I was 4 months along then." She paused, gathering her strength. "3 weeks ago, I had the baby." The day after, Lloyd Patterson showed up with 3 men, claiming Thomas owed him $500 from a poker game, and that he'd put up our land deed as collateral. Matthew leaned against the wall, his expression darkening. Lloyd Patterson runs with that bunch from Las Vegas. Margaret nodded. You know of him, by reputation. Go on. Thomas wasn't a gambling man, Margaret continued. Maybe he played cards occasionally in town, but he would never have bet our land. The deed was in both our names anyway, he couldn't have wagered it alone. She stroked her baby's cheek with one finger. I told Patterson as much, and he seemed to leave peacefully enough. But he came back 3 nights ago with more men. Said if I wouldn't honor my husband's debt, they'd take what was owed another way. She swallowed hard, remembering the terror of that night. They started searching the house. I grabbed my husband's pistol from under the bed, told them to leave. One of them laughed and came toward me. I fired, hit him in the leg, then Patterson shot me. Her voice faltered. While they were dealing with their injured man, I grabbed the baby and ran for the stable. I knew they'd come after me not just because I shot one of them, but because Patterson wants our land. It's not much, but there's a good spring on the property. Eliza made a sympathetic sound. Water rights are worth killing for in these parts. Matthew pushed away from the wall, his jaw tight. Patterson's claiming you stole something from him. Probably the deed, Margaret said bitterly. He's trying to make it look like I'm the thief when he's the one trying to steal my land. She looked down at her daughter again. All I have left to give her. A silence fell over the room as Matthew and Eliza absorbed her story. Finally, Matthew spoke. Mrs. Easton, would you mind giving us a moment? Eliza glanced between them, then nodded. I'll go check on supper. Margaret, you should try to feed the baby yourself soon. Your milk might come back now that you're on the mend. After Eliza left, Matthew pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Patterson's dangerous, he said quietly. Him and his men have been causing trouble all across the territory. Sheriff won't do much either, too scared or being paid off, I'd wager. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with her fever. What am I going to do? I can't go back to the homestead, but I have nowhere else to go. Matthew's eyes met hers steadily. You'll stay here until you're healed. The Eastons are good people, they won't turn you out. As for Patterson, he straightened, determination evident in the set of his shoulders. Let me worry about him. I can't ask you to get involved in my troubles, Margaret protested. You've done too much already. You didn't ask, Matthew replied simply. And I've had my own run-ins with men like Patterson, men who think they can take whatever they want because no one will stand against them. Something in his tone suggested personal experience, but before Margaret could ask, he continued. For now, you focus on healing and taking care of your little one. Have you decided on a name for her yet? The sudden change in subject caught Margaret off guard, but she welcomed it. No. Thomas and I had talked about naming her after his mother if it was a girl, but she trailed off, looking at the peaceful face of her sleeping daughter. I'm not sure anymore. Matthew nodded, not pressing. Well, she's a strong one, made it through quite an ordeal for someone so tiny. Margaret felt the first genuine smile in days tug at her lips. She did, didn't she? She studied Matthew's face, noting the kindness in his eyes despite his rugged appearance. Mr. Donovan, Matthew, he corrected. Matthew, she amended. Why did you help us? You could have just reported finding us to the sheriff. He was quiet for a moment, seemingly considering his words carefully. 8 years ago, my sister was in trouble. Different circumstances, but she needed help and didn't get it in time. His eyes held a distant pain. I wasn't there when she needed me. I promised myself I'd never turn away from someone who needed help again, especially not a woman and child. The simple honesty of his answer touched something in Margaret. Before she could respond, however, her daughter began to stir, making small mewling sounds that would soon turn to hungry cries. I should try to feed her, Margaret said. Matthew stood immediately, color rising in his cheeks again. Of course. I'll let you be. He moved toward the door, then paused. Mrs. Keller, Margaret, she said, returning his earlier courtesy. A small smile crossed his face. Margaret, you're safe here. I give you my word. As he left, closing the door quietly behind him, Margaret looked down at her daughter, who was now fully awake and beginning to fuss. What do you think, little one? She whispered. Can we trust him? The baby's only response was to wave a tiny fist and turn her face toward her mother's chest, instinctively seeking nourishment. Margaret adjusted her nightgown with her good arm and tried to position her daughter to nurse. For the first time in days, she felt the tingling sensation that preceded her milk letting down. Whether it was the rest, Eliza's care, or simply the newfound sense of security Matthew Donovan had promised, Margaret couldn't say, but as her daughter latched on and began to suckle, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Hannah, she said softly, the name coming to her suddenly. Hannah Grace Keller, that's your name. She stroked the downy hair on her daughter's head. And we're going to be all right. The next week passed in a blur of pain, healing, and gradually regaining her strength. The Easton Ranch, Margaret learned, was a modest but successful operation about 12 miles northwest of Abiquiu. James Easton, Eliza's husband, was a gruff but fair man who seemed to accept Margaret's presence without question, once his wife had decided to take her in. Matthew Donovan, she discovered, had been with the Eastons for 3 years, working his way up from ordinary ranch hand to foreman. He was respected by the other cowboys and treated almost like a son by the Eastons, who had no children of their own. Each day, Matthew would check on Margaret and Hannah before riding out with the men, and each evening he'd return, often bringing small gifts, a carved wooden rattle for Hannah one day, a book of poetry for Margaret the next. His visits became something she looked forward to, even as she told herself not to grow accustomed to his attention. By the end of the week, Margaret was able to move around the small guest room unassisted, though her shoulder still ached fiercely if she tried to use that arm. Hannah was thriving, having regained the weight she'd lost during their ordeal and then some, her cheeks plumping with good health. You're both recovering nicely, Eliza pronounced one morning after changing Margaret's bandages. Another week and you might be ready to think about what comes next. The thought filled Margaret with dread. She had nowhere to go, very little money, and Patterson's men were still presumably looking for her. The homestead was out of the question, at least until Patterson was dealt with, if that was even possible. I don't want to impose on your kindness any longer than necessary, Margaret said carefully. Eliza waved away her concern. Nonsense. Winter's coming on and you'll need a safe place until spring at least. James and I have plenty of room. She smiled down at Hannah, who was playing on a blanket on the floor. Besides, it's been a joy having a baby in the house. Makes me feel young again. That evening, when Matthew came to visit, Margaret was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the sunset paint the distant mesas in shades of gold and crimson. Hannah was asleep in a cradle the ranch carpenter had hastily assembled from spare lumber. You look better, Matthew observed, taking the seat across from her. I feel better, Margaret admitted. Eliza says I'm healing well. Matthew nodded, then seemed to hesitate before reaching into his coat pocket. I have something for you. He withdrew a folded document and handed it to her. Margaret opened it with her good hand and gasped when she realized what she was holding. This is my deed, she said, looking up at him in astonishment. How did you get it? Rode out to your homestead yesterday, Matthew explained. Figured Patterson might have men watching the place, but I didn't see any sign of them. The house had been ransacked, but they must not have found what they were looking for. A slight smile crossed his face. Found it under a loose floorboard in what looked to be the bedroom. Margaret clutched the deed to her chest, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. This means everything to Hannah's future." She hesitated, then asked, "Was there? Did you see any sign of my husband's journal? It would be a small leather book." Matthew shook his head. "Didn't have much time to look around. Was there something important in it?" "Just memories," Margaret said, feeling a pang of loss. Thomas had kept a journal for years, recording everything from weather patterns to his thoughts on becoming a father. It was one of the few personal items of his she'd hoped to save for Hannah. "It doesn't matter. This is what's important." She held up the deed. Matthew's expression grew serious. "There's something else you should know. I asked around town about Patterson. He and his men were seen heading north toward Colorado territory 2 days ago." Hope flared in Margaret's chest. "They're gone." "For now," Matthew cautioned. "But men like Patterson don't give up easily on something they want, and he still thinks you have whatever it is he's claiming you stole." The brief moment of hope faded. "So I'm still not safe?" "Not at the homestead, no." Matthew leaned forward. "But no one knows you're here, and the Eastons offer to let you stay stands, at least until we figure out a more permanent solution." Margaret sighed, looking over at her sleeping daughter. "I can't live in fear forever, Matthew. I need to build a life for Hannah." "I know," he said softly. "And you will." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Margaret was struck by the sincerity in his gaze. In the short time she'd known him, Matthew Donovan had shown her more kindness than most people had in her entire life. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, echoing her question from days before, still not entirely understanding his investment in her welfare. Matthew was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting to Hannah's cradle. "When I found you that night, you were ready to die protecting your child. You'd been shot, were half frozen, but you still tried to send me away because you didn't know if you could trust me." His voice grew softer. "That kind of courage deserves a chance." Before Margaret could respond, Hannah began to stir, making the small sounds that preceded waking. Matthew stood as Margaret moved to the cradle. "I should let you tend to her," he said. "There's a cattle buyer coming tomorrow, so I might be busy most of the day, but I'll check in when I can." Margaret lifted Hannah with her good arm, the baby blinking sleepily up at her. "We'll be here," she said, offering Matthew a genuine smile. "Thank you again. For everything." After he left, Margaret sat in the rocking chair Eliza had placed in her room, nursing Hannah and watching the last light fade from the sky. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to think beyond mere survival. Perhaps there could be a future for her and Hannah here, in this place where kindness seemed to outweigh the harshness of frontier life. As October gave way to November, Margaret's strength returned more fully. Her shoulder, though still stiff and marked by an angry red scar, had healed enough for her to hold Hannah properly and help with light chores around the ranch house. She insisted on contributing, unable to accept the Eastons' generosity without giving something in return. Eliza taught her to make soap from rendered fat and lye, a skill Margaret had never mastered on her own homestead. James Easton, initially gruff and distant, gradually warmed to her presence, especially when she proved to be a decent hand at bookkeeping, helping organize the ranch's accounts with a precision his arthritic hands no longer managed. And then there was Matthew. Their evening conversations had become a fixture in Margaret's life, something she anticipated throughout the day. He told her stories of his childhood in Missouri, his years working cattle drives from Texas, the sister he'd lost to influenza. In turn, she shared memories of her life before Thomas, growing up in a small Pennsylvania town, her journey west as a new bride 5 years earlier, What began as gratitude on her part evolved into something deeper, though Margaret was careful to keep her growing feelings hidden. Matthew had responsibilities at the ranch, a life established before she stumbled into it. She was still a widow with a young child and uncertain prospects, hardly in a position to entertain romantic notions. One crisp morning in late November, Margaret bundled Hannah against the cold and ventured out to the corral where Matthew was working with a young colt. She'd rarely left the immediate vicinity of the ranch house since her arrival, but today felt different, the sky impossibly blue, the air sharp and clean in her lungs. Matthew looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a wide smile that made something flutter in Margaret's chest. "Two beautiful ladies come to visit," he called, securing the colt before walking over to the fence. "Hello there, Miss Hannah," he said, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. At nearly 2 months old, Hannah had become more responsive, and she gurgled happily at the familiar voice. "We thought we'd get some fresh air," Margaret explained. "I've been cooped up too long." Matthew nodded approvingly. "It's a fine day for it, not too cold yet." He glanced back at the colt. "I'm nearly finished here. Would you like to walk down to the creek? The view's nice, and it's sheltered from the wind." The invitation was simple enough, but it felt significant somehow, the first time they would be truly alone together outside the confines of her room or the main house, where others were always nearby. "I'd like that," Margaret said. They walked side by side down a well-worn path, Matthew shortening his stride to match hers, occasionally reaching out a steadying hand when the ground grew uneven. The creek, when they reached it, was partially frozen along its edges, the center still flowing freely between banks dusted with the season's first light snow. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, breathing in the pine-scented air. "One of my favorite spots," Matthew agreed. He gestured to a large, flat rock warmed by the mid-morning sun. "Would you like to sit for a bit?" As they settled on the sun-warmed stone, Hannah nestled securely between them. Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The constant fear that had been her companion since Patterson's first visit to the homestead seemed distant here, muted by the gentle sounds of water over stones and the occasional call of a bird. "I've been thinking," Matthew said after a comfortable silence, "about your situation." Margaret tensed slightly. "Oh," winter's setting in. "You and Hannah are welcome with the Eastons for as long as you need, but I know you're worried about Patterson returning in the spring." She nodded, looking down at Hannah, who had fallen asleep in her warm wrappings. "I can't go back to the homestead. Even with the deed safe, it's too isolated. If Patterson or men like him came back. What if you didn't have to choose between safety and independence?" Matthew asked, his voice careful, measured. Margaret looked up at him, curious. "What do you mean?" Matthew seemed to gather himself, as if preparing for something momentous. "I've saved a fair amount these past few years, enough to buy a small place closer to town. Not as big as your homestead, maybe, but good land with water rights." He paused, watching her face. "I plan to make an offer on it next spring." "That sounds wonderful," Margaret said, unsure where this was leading but happy for him. "You deserve your own place after all your hard work." "The thing is," Matthew continued, his gaze unwavering, "a man alone on a small ranch. It's a hard life." "Harder than it needs to be." Margaret's heart began to beat faster as his meaning became clearer. "Matthew, I know it's soon," he said quickly. "Too soon, maybe. You're still grieving Thomas, and we've only known each other a short while, but I've come to care for you, Margaret, for Hannah too." He glanced down at the sleeping baby. "I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be presumptuous. But I am offering partnership, safety, a home where Patterson wouldn't dare come looking." Margaret was speechless, her mind racing. It was true that she'd grown to care for Matthew more than she should, perhaps, given her circumstances. But what he was suggesting? "You've been kind to us," she finally managed. "Kinder than anyone had a right to expect. But I can't accept your offer just because I'm afraid and have few options." Matthew nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her response. "I wouldn't want you to. That's not what I'm asking." He took a deep breath. "When I found you that night, I admired your courage. As I've come to know you, I've admired so much more your intelligence, your strength, your gentleness with Hannah. I'm not offering a solution to your problem, Margaret. I'm offering a beginning if you want it." His honesty disarmed her. There was no artifice in Matthew Donovan, no hidden motive she could discern. Just a man offering what he could to a woman he'd come to care for. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything now," Matthew assured her. "It's a lot to consider. I just wanted you to know there are options beyond hiding here or returning to the homestead alone." Margaret looked out at the creek, gathering her thoughts. "Thomas and I had a good marriage," she said finally. "Not perfect, no marriages, but good. When he died, I thought that part of my life was over." She turned back to Matthew. "I never expected to meet someone like you." Hope flickered in his eyes. "Is that a yes?" "It's a maybe," Margaret said, allowing a small smile. "A strong maybe. I need time, Matthew, to be sure I'm making this choice for the right reasons." "Time is something we have," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Winter's long in these parts." As if on cue, Hannah stirred between them, opening her eyes and regarding Matthew with a solemn gaze before breaking into a toothless smile that made both adults laugh. "I think she approves," Matthew said softly. "She's easily impressed," Margaret teased. But the warmth spreading through her chest had little to do with the November sun and everything to do with the possibility of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. They stayed by the creek a while longer, talking of practical things where Matthew's prospective land was located. What kind of house might be built there? How Margaret's experience growing vegetables would complement his skills with livestock. It was easier to discuss these details than the emotional undercurrents flowing between them. But Margaret found herself envisioning the life he described with increasing clarity. As they walked back to the ranch house, Hannah once again secured in her mother's arms. Matthew kept a respectful distance, having said his piece and clearly willing to give Margaret the space she needed to consider his offer. It was this, perhaps more than anything, that made her realize how deeply she had come to trust him. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed the ranch and surrounding countryside in pristine white. The beauty of it took Margaret's breath away, though the cold made her injured shoulder ache in ways that reminded her how recently she'd been fighting for her life. Life at the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. The cattle were brought in closer to the buildings for the winter, the men's work shifting from open range to the daily chores of feeding and maintaining the herd through the cold months. Inside the main house, Eliza taught Margaret to quilt, while James entertained Hannah with surprisingly gentle patience for a man of his rough exterior. Matthew remained attentive but never pressing, his offer hanging between them unmentioned but not forgotten. Margaret caught him watching her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice a look of quiet longing that matched the growing certainty in her own heart. One evening, as Christmas approached, Eliza enlisted Margaret's help decorating the main room of the ranch house. As they hung simple ornaments on a small pine tree James and one of the hands had brought in, Eliza broached the subject that had clearly been on her mind. "Matthew's sweet on you," she said without preamble, in her characteristically direct way. Margaret's hand stilled on the strand of dried berries she was arranging. "I know." "And," Eliza prompted, fixing a candle holder to one of the branches. "And it's complicated," Margaret sighed. "I care for him, More than I expected to, but I was married less than a year ago, Eliza. I have Hannah to think about. The older woman nodded thoughtfully. My first husband died when I was 22, she said, surprising Margaret with this previously unshared information. Fever took him quick. I thought I'd never love again, didn't want to, if I'm honest. Then I met James 2 years later. Stubborn as a mule, that man, but he showed me life goes on. She paused, looking at Margaret directly. Thomas would want you and his daughter to be happy, wouldn't he? Yes, Margaret whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. He would. Matthew's a good man, Eliza continued, her tone gentler now. One of the best I've known. He doesn't offer his heart lightly. I know that too. Margaret resumed her work on the berry strand, considering her next words carefully. He's offered me a partnership, a home for Hannah and me. Eliza's eyebrows rose. Has he now? And what did you say? That I needed time. Margaret looked toward the window where snow was falling gently in the gathering dusk. But I think I've had enough time. Eliza smiled, satisfaction evident in her expression. Well then. No time like Christmas for new beginnings, is there? The ranch's Christmas celebration was modest but warm, with a special dinner prepared by Eliza and Margaret, small gifts exchanged, and carols sung around the fire afterward. The ranch hands who hadn't gone to town or to visit family joined them, creating a makeshift family that reminded Margaret of holidays back east before she'd ventured west with Thomas. Matthew gave Hannah a small stuffed horse he'd commissioned from a woman in town who made children's toys. For Margaret, he had a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. To replace your husband's, he explained quietly as the others were engaged in conversation across the room. For new memories, for Hannah. The thoughtfulness of the gift moved her deeply. Thank you, she said, running her fingers over the smooth cover. I have something for you too, but not here. Could you meet me on the porch later? Curiosity lit his eyes, but he nodded. Of course. Hours later, after the celebrations had wound down and Hannah was asleep in her cradle, Margaret wrapped herself in a heavy shawl and stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped, and the night was clear. Stars like diamonds scattered across the velvet sky. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she waited. The door opened behind her, and Matthew emerged, pulling on his coat. Cold night to be outdoors, he observed, moving to stand beside her at the porch rail. But beautiful, Margaret replied, looking up at the star-filled expanse above them. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the occasional stamp of horses in the nearby corral and the distant howl of a coyote. You said you had something for me, Matthew finally asked. Margaret turned to face him, gathering her courage. Not exactly a gift you can hold, she said, more of an answer. Matthew went very still, his eyes fixed on her face. An answer to your offer, Margaret clarified. About the land, the house, about us. And his voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the hope he was trying to contain. Yes, she said simply. My answer is yes, Matthew. The transformation of his expression was like watching the sun rise gradual at first, then blazing with unexpected brilliance. You're sure? Margaret nodded, finding certainty in the moment. These past months, you've shown me who you are, not just the man who rescued us that night, but the man who visits every evening even when he's exhausted, who carved a rattle for Hannah, who found my deed and brought it back to me. She stepped closer to him. The man I've come to care for very much. Matthew reached out slowly as if giving her time to withdraw and took her hand in his. I'll do right by you both, Margaret, I swear it. I know you will, she said softly. That's why my answer is yes. When he kissed her, it was gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as she responded. His arms encircled her carefully, mindful of her still healing shoulder, and Margaret leaned into his solid warmth, feeling for the first time in months that she was exactly where she belonged. The kiss ended naturally, but Matthew kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Matthew," she replied, her heart full of a joy she'd thought never to feel again. The new year of 1879 brought changes both expected and surprising. News of Margaret and Matthew's understanding not quite an engagement, but heading decisively in that direction, was met with approval from the Eastons and good-natured ribbing from the ranch hands who had witnessed the progression of their relationship. In January, Matthew rode into Abiquiu to inquire about the land he hoped to purchase. He returned with the unexpected news that the current owner was eager to sell and willing to accept a lower price than originally asked if the deal could be completed before spring. "He's moving back east," Matthew explained to Margaret as they sat before the fire in the main room, Hannah asleep in her mother's arms. "Said his wife can't take another New Mexico winter, wants to be gone by March." Margaret considered this development. "That's sooner than we planned." "It is," Matthew agreed. "But it's good land, Margaret. 10 acres with water rights, a small but solid house, some outbuildings that need work but are structurally sound, just 4 miles from town." He hesitated. "I can try to negotiate for more time, but—" "No," Margaret interrupted, decision made. "If it's the right place, we should take it. Hannah and I have imposed on the Eastons' hospitality long enough." Matthew's expression softened. "You know they don't see it that way." "Even so," Margaret insisted. "It's time I stood on my own feet again." "Our feet," Matthew corrected gently. "Together." The word sent a warm flutter through Margaret's chest. "Together," she echoed. February brought milder weather and a flurry of preparations. Matthew made several trips to the property, each time returning with detailed reports on what needed to be done before they could move in. Margaret began gathering supplies for their new home, seeds for a garden, fabric for curtains and bedding, kitchen utensils to supplement the few basic items the previous owner was leaving behind. Throughout these preparations, a question hovered unspoken between them. Though they had agreed to a partnership, a future together, they had not discussed the precise nature of that arrangement once they moved to the new property. Margaret, conscious of appearances and her status as a widow with a young child, wondered if Matthew expected marriage before they established their household. The matter was settled one evening in late February as they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Hannah was indoors with Eliza, who had practically claimed the baby as her own grandchild and delighted in any opportunity to care for her. "I've been thinking," Matthew began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "about our move next month." Margaret turned to look at him, noting the serious set of his features. "So have I." "I spoke to Pastor Wilson in town yesterday," Matthew continued, "about whether he might be available to perform a ceremony before we move to the new place." A small smile tugged at Margaret's lips. "Did you now?" "And what did the good pastor say?" "He said any Sunday after services would do nicely," Matthew replied, his eyes searching her face. "If that would suit the bride, of course." Margaret pretended to consider this. "The bride would need a dress, I suppose, and there's the matter of a ring." "I might have thought of that," Matthew admitted, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "It's not fancy," he warned as he handed it to her, "but it belonged to my grandmother. My mother gave it to me before she passed, said to save it for when I found the right woman." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the pouch and tipped a delicate gold band into her palm. It was a simple ring, worn smooth by years of wear, but beautiful in its understated elegance. "Matthew," she breathed, looking up to find him watching her intently. "I know we've talked around this," he said, taking her free hand in his. "Discussed partnership and living arrangements and practical matters, but I want to be clear now." He took a deep breath. "Margaret Keller, I love you. I want to be your husband, Hannah's father in every way that matters, and build a life with you both. Will you marry me?" The directness of his proposal, the undisguised emotion in his voice, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. This was no arrangement of convenience, no practical solution to her precarious situation. This was a declaration of love from a man who had proven his worth in every way that mattered. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." The kiss that followed was different from their first, less hesitant, more certain, a promise sealed between them as the last light of day faded from the western sky. They were married on the first Sunday in March, in the small wooden church in Abiquiu. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the Eastons, several of the ranch hands who had become friends, and a few townspeople who had come to know Matthew over the years. Margaret wore a dove-gray dress that Eliza had helped her alter, with a touch of lace at the collar and cuffs. Hannah, now almost 4 months old, was dressed in a white gown that had once belonged to Eliza's niece, watching the proceedings with wide, solemn eyes from James Easton's careful hold. As Pastor Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, and Matthew's lips met hers in a tender kiss, Margaret felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find again. The journey that had begun in terror and pain had led her here, to this moment of profound joy, to a future filled with promise. Their new home, modest but sturdy, sat on a gentle rise overlooking a small creek that wound through the property. The previous owner had maintained it well enough, though Margaret immediately saw a dozen ways to improve the interior, while Matthew assessed repairs needed for the barn and corral. They moved in a week after the wedding, their few possessions loaded onto a wagon borrowed from the Easton ranch. The Eastons themselves helped with the move, Eliza fussing over the placement of furniture, and James offering gruff advice about the livestock. Matthew had purchased 2 milk cows, a half-dozen chickens, and a pair of sturdy workhorses in addition to his own riding horse. By the time the Eastons departed in the late afternoon, promising to visit soon, the house had begun to feel like home. Margaret stood in the doorway, Hannah on her hip, watching as Matthew thanked his former employers with heartfelt handshakes and Eliza's inevitable tearful embrace. "Well, Mrs. Donovan," Matthew said as he joined her in the doorway, watching the Easton's wagon disappear down the road. "Here we are." The name, her new name, still felt strange to Margaret's ears, but pleasantly so. "Here we are," she agreed, leaning into his side as his arm circled her waist. "Are you happy?" he asked, a touch of uncertainty in his voice. Margaret looked up at him, then at Hannah, who was reaching for Matthew with a determined expression. "Very happy," she said, meaning it completely. As Matthew took Hannah in his arms, the baby immediately grabbing for his beard as had become her habit, Margaret felt a rush of love for this family they were creating, unexpected, unplanned, but no less precious for that. Their first weeks in the new home established patterns that would shape their life together. Matthew worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, preparing fields for planting, and building the small herd of cattle he'd invested in with his savings. Margaret transformed the house room by room, planted a kitchen garden as soon as the ground was workable, and cared for Hannah, who grew more active and curious by the day. In the evenings, they would sit together on the small porch, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains, talking of the day's events and their plans for the future. Sometimes Matthew would read aloud from one of the few books they owned, Or Margaret would sing songs from her childhood while Hannah drifted to sleep in her father's arms. It was during one such evening, as April gave way to May, and the land around them burst into spring bloom, that Margaret broached a subject that had been on her mind. "I received a letter today," she said, as they sat side by side in the chairs Matthew had crafted during the winter months. "From Sheriff Morris in town." Matthew looked up from the piece of harness he was mending. "Oh, what did he want?" "He had news about Lloyd Patterson," Margaret said, watching her husband's expression carefully. "Apparently, Patterson and 2 of his men were killed in a dispute over cards in a Denver saloon. The others scattered." Matthew was quiet for a moment, digesting this information. "How do you feel about that?" he finally asked. Margaret considered the question honestly. "Relieved," she admitted. "I've tried not to think about him, about the threat he posed, but it's been there in the back of my mind, wondering if he might come looking for us for the deed, for revenge. And now I can truly put it behind me," Margaret said, reaching for Matthew's hand. "This life, our life, it's real now, not just a temporary refuge." Matthew squeezed her hand gently. "It was always real to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant call of whippoorwills and Hannah's soft breathing from her cradle just inside the open door. "I've been thinking," Margaret said eventually, "about the future, about family." Matthew set aside his work, giving her his full attention. "What about it?" "Hannah is thriving," Margaret said, a smile touching her lips as she glanced toward her daughter. "And I would like her to have siblings. Not right away, perhaps, but someday." The slow smile that spread across Matthew's face warmed her to her core. "I'd like that too," he said, his voice low and intimate in the gathering dusk. "Very much." Their kiss was interrupted by Hannah's sudden cry, making them both laugh as they broke apart. "I'll get her," Matthew said, rising to his feet. "You rest." As Margaret watched him tenderly lift Hannah from her cradle, murmuring soothing words that quickly quieted the baby's fussing, she marveled at how completely this man had embraced fatherhood. From those first desperate hours when he'd held Hannah while Margaret was too wounded to care for her, to now, when he claimed the baby as his own in all the ways that mattered, Matthew Donovan had proven himself the best of men. Life, Margaret had learned, could change in an instant. A single gunshot, a chance encounter, a moment of courage or kindness, these could alter the course of everything that followed. The path that had led her to this place, to this family, had been marked by both tragedy and blessing, often impossible to distinguish from one another until time revealed their true nature. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked as he rejoined her, Hannah now contentedly nestled against his shoulder. Margaret smiled, reaching out to touch her daughter's soft cheek, then her husband's weathered hand. "How fortunate we are," she said simply. "All of us." The years that followed brought both joy and challenge to the Donovan homestead. The small ranch prospered under Matthew's careful management, the herd growing slowly but steadily, while Margaret's garden expanded to provide not only for their table but enough surplus to trade in town for goods they couldn't produce themselves. Hannah grew from a baby to a toddler to a bright, curious child with her mother's dark hair and her adopted father's blue eyes. She followed Matthew everywhere, helping with chores from the moment she could walk, soaking up his patient explanations of ranch life like a sponge. In the summer of 1880, Margaret discovered she was expecting their first child together. The pregnancy was easier than her first had been, perhaps because this time she had proper care and nutrition, or perhaps simply because this time she wasn't grieving while trying to manage a homestead alone. Joshua James Donovan arrived on a snowy February morning in 1881, a robust boy with his father's strong features and a lusty cry that announced his arrival to the world with unmistakable vigor. Hannah, not yet 3, approached her new brother with a mixture of curiosity and proprietary pride, declaring him "my baby" to anyone who would listen. Matthew's joy in his son was evident in everything from the careful way he held the infant to the elaborate cradle he constructed in the evenings after his ranch work was done. But it was his continuing devotion to Hannah that touched Margaret most deeply, his insistence that she was as much his child as Joshua, his patient answers to her endless questions, his genuine delight in her accomplishments. The summer Joshua turned 1, Matthew expanded the house, adding a proper bedroom for Hannah and a small study where Margaret could write in the journal he'd given her that first Christmas. By then, she'd filled 2 such books with the story of their family, not just for Hannah to know her birth father, but for all their children to understand the journey that had brought them together. Their family grew again with the birth of Emma Elizabeth Donovan in 1883, a delicate girl with her mother's gentle disposition, who nonetheless showed an early aptitude for the rough and tumble life of the ranch. By the time she was 5, she could ride as confidently as Hannah, who at 10 had become her father's right hand during cattle drives and roundups. Life wasn't without its hardships. The drought of 1885 threatened their livelihood, forcing Matthew to sell part of the herd at a loss to ensure they could feed the remaining animals through the winter. A harsh winter the following year brought illness to the household, with all 3 children falling ill with influenza that left Margaret sleepless for weeks as she nursed them back to health. But through it all, the foundation Matthew and Margaret had built held firm. Their partnership, begun in those desperate days when he had held her and her newborn daughter while she healed, had deepened into a love that weathered every challenge with the same quiet strength that had marked their beginnings. On a warm evening in the summer of 1888, nearly a decade after that fateful night by the creek, Margaret sat on their expanded porch, watching as Matthew taught Hannah and Joshua to throw a lasso while Emma looked on, determined to have her turn despite her brother's protests that she was still too small. "Papa said I could try next," Emma insisted, her hands on her hips in a posture that mirrored her mother's so perfectly it made Margaret smile. "Let your sister have a turn, Josh," Matthew instructed, handing the rope to Hannah while he adjusted Emma's stance. "She needs to learn too." "Girls don't need to rope cattle," Joshua grumbled, though without real conviction he'd seen his older sister outperform most boys her age too many times to truly believe his own words. "This girl does," Hannah said matter-of-factly, demonstrating a perfect throw that settled neatly around the practice post. At 13, she was tall for her age, with a confident bearing that made her seem older. "And she'll probably be better at it than you if you don't practice more." The good-natured squabble continued as Matthew patiently supervised Emma's attempts, his praise for her clumsy efforts as genuine as it had been for Hannah's more polished performance. Margaret watched them all, her heart full to bursting with love for this family that had come together in the most unexpected of ways. When Matthew glanced up and caught her watching, the smile he sent her way was as warm and intimate as the first time he'd kissed her on that snowy Christmas night. 10 years of marriage, 3 children, countless challenges and triumphs, and still, that smile could make her breath catch. Later, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Margaret and Matthew sat together on the porch as had become their custom, watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. "I saw Doc Wilson in town today," Matthew said, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "He mentioned Hannah's doing well in her studies, said she might make a fine doctor herself someday with the right education." Margaret nodded, having had similar thoughts herself. Hannah's intelligence and her natural way with injured animals had long suggested she might have a calling beyond the ranch. She'd need to go east for proper schooling. "I've been thinking about that," Matthew said, his tone thoughtful. "We could manage it, I believe. The ranch is doing well enough now, and I've put some aside each year." The casual way he spoke of providing such an opportunity for Hannah, a girl not his by blood but wholly his by choice, made Margaret's eyes fill with tears of gratitude. "You're an extraordinary man, Matthew Donovan." He shrugged, embarrassed by her praise as always. "She's our daughter. She deserves every chance we can give her." He paused, then added, "All our children do." "I've been writing to my cousin in Philadelphia," Margaret admitted. "She says Hannah could stay with them if she wanted to attend the women's medical college there." Matthew nodded slowly. "It's good to have options. She's young, yet plenty of time to decide." They lapsed into comfortable silence, the future stretching before them with all its possibilities, both known and yet to be discovered. "You ever think about that night?" Margaret asked suddenly. "When you found Hannah and me by the creek?" Matthew's hand tightened on hers. "Sometimes. Mostly I think about how close I came to missing you entirely, if I'd taken a different route on patrol, if you'd hidden better." He shook his head. "It doesn't bear thinking about. I was so afraid," Margaret remembered, "of you, of everything. I couldn't even hold Hannah properly." "You were the bravest person I'd ever seen," Matthew countered. "Wounded, exhausted, but still protecting your child with everything you had." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, remembering the desperation of those moments and marveling at the journey that had followed. "I couldn't have imagined this life then," she said softly. "All of us together, the children, the ranch. It seemed impossible that anything good could come from such darkness. Yet here we are," Matthew said, his arm circling her shoulders to draw her closer. "Here we are," Margaret agreed, turning her face up to his for a kiss that still, after all these years, felt like coming home. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved. Outside, the land they had nurtured spread in all directions, a testament to their hard work and determination. And between them, in the quiet understanding that had grown from those first tentative days of healing, lay the foundation of everything they had built together. A chance encounter on a desperate night had brought them to each other, a wounded woman too weak to care for her newborn child, and a cowboy with the courage to hold them both until she could heal. What had begun as simple human kindness had blossomed into a love story neither could have anticipated. A family forged not just by blood but by choice, by commitment, by the daily decision to face life's challenges together. As the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of another day in their shared life, Margaret Donovan offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had led her home.